My name is Michael Mityoke. I am the founder of the Vancouver Debate Academy. We started 7 years ago. I was an educator before I was a business person, and I'd always been searching for something that was going to really excite kids to come to class, right? And debate turned out to be the thing. And I wasn't a debater actually through school. And when I was teaching, I was a writing instructor. So I just, as a business owner, when I started the academy, I just sort of fumbled into it, really, to be frank. The purpose of this YouTube channel is to have students choose topics and really have discussions. The plan is to do 2 or 3 a month, and it's all going to be student focused. This is not about branding. This is not about marketing. It's basically a public service, and it's a means by which the kids in our community get to share their insights into the important topics of the day. So with that being said, I hope this channel finds an audience, and thanks very much.
All right, let's start by talking a bit about political correctness. I've always had a not so great relationship with this term, mostly because it implies that there's a right way of, there's an objectively right way of believing in terms of politics and political beliefs.
I think in modern day, especially in our generation, there are a lot of people who are afraid to say what they actually want to say because they think that it is not politically correct. In other words, they feel that there's going to be overwhelming disagreement in the room if they said what they said. And oftentimes it's about the narratives that medias create.
And it's intrinsically connected also to cancel culture, where people, there's no way for people to express their true opinions or to change those opinions if we don't give people an avenue to even say those opinions and to have productive dialogue.
It really went from maybe I won't say it because people will disagree with me to maybe I won't, say what I actually believe in so that I can get a job or so that I can get into a school almost in this day and age.
And of course there is the question of misinformation, disinformation, science versus, perhaps other opinions or theories. To a certain extent, we need to find balance in what we consider as objectively true versus the various nuances and perspectives that can exist on a problem. We don't want to go out there and start shutting down every single religious belief that is presented to us on the internet. I'm agnostic and I am not particularly religious in one way or another, but I'm not going to go out on the internet and say, no, you can't talk about Christianity because I don't believe in that.
Yeah, it's also about what we now can talk about. Am I able to really speak on these issues that I want to speak on if this is going to be about identity politics?
Yeah.
If I've never experienced oppression myself, can I still speak on that oppression, or can I still speak for people that have had experiences with
or can I even be involved in that discussion?
Yeah. And I think sometimes this happens in debate too. I'm not sure how I feel about this being on YouTube, but I think people have ran arguments about minorities, about oppression, and they're very valid arguments. And sometimes their opponents will come up and say look, it's 2 people belonging to this race talking about these things, and therefore the argument is invalid.
There's even the saying, quote unquote, I can't believe I'm hearing this from a white man. Not my personal opinion, obviously, but that has been said to people in debate rounds. And so I think what this perpetuates is the sense that, no, it's not dialogue, actually. There's a certain group of people, only that group of people is allowed to talk freely about this thing. That's actually pretty counterproductive to democratic discourse and dialogue.
For sure.
Recently at UBC, there was this idea of creating a separate space for Black students. So a cordoned off space where only Black students would be allowed to go.
Segregation.
That's what I'm not saying that these spaces don't need to exist. What I'm thinking is that these spaces can exist on an intellectual level because fundamentally, it's not necessarily social segregation. It's like on an intellectual level, perhaps I relate more to this group of people, right? My upbringing, my family's culture, I can relate more to a group of people. But I think that happens on the intellectual level. It's not something that we cordon off and restrict, because that becomes exclusionary. And I think what that prevents is productive dialogue and productive discourse, where we're able to learn and build off of different groups of people's experiences and create an aggregate society where everyone's opinions, no matter how perhaps extreme, can be heard. And these opinions have to be heard in order for them to be perhaps refuted, or like there has to be a back and forth. And when we silence it, there's nothing there.
I think ideally it's about allowing people to say what they want to say and engaging with what they want to say.
And listening to what they want to say.
Based off of who that person is, but rather like the logic and the facts behind what they're trying to say. It's too easy for people to shut down arguments based on who is making that argument. It's not about the argument itself anymore, it's about a person delivering the speech. Not just in the debate space, but like just in civil discourse.
Online, in the comments on YouTube videos.
Oh my God, people fight so much these days.
It's like they're fighting over something that has no definite answer. And each side, I find,
thinks that there is a definite answer.
Thinks that there is a definite answer and that they absolutely have the definite answer.
And if the other person doesn't believe in that answer,
they're wrong.
They're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be because they're intrinsically wrong
Yeah.
because of who they are.
But if we end up like living in a world where we all think that each other is wrong, we're never going to get anywhere, because then everyone's wrong. Everyone's making assumptions about each
no one
other.
is right.
There you go.
It's kind of like a false dichotomy, because at the end of the day, there isn't really something that is 100% right or 100% wrong.
There's always nuance.
There's always going to be a gray area, and I think that's where discourse and dialogue occurs, and it's important to foster that instead of cutting it off, just so that what you believe in can be the ultimate thing.
Mm-hmm. And especially in our generation, I feel like when I'm talking to my classmates, there's the sense that they have an idea of what is absolutely right, and they don't want to budge on that idea, and they think that everyone else who disagrees with them is absolutely wrong. Therefore, society is going down the drain. Everything sucks. We're all gonna die.
I think it's about both sides, right?
But it's both sides. And what's interesting, though, especially like in the U.S. politically, right? We consider there's like left wing, right wing, etc.
Yeah.
What I found kind of interesting is that on both extremes, they say bad things about each other and good things about themselves.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is they're often more accurate about what's bad about the other side than about what's good about themselves. The bad things are the things that are right. And I think that's something as a society we need to reflect on in terms of how we approach public discourse now, because I think it's kind of snowballed into something that's more of an emotional clash and conflict versus a dialogue, an open-minded dialogue and discussion.
Yeah, for sure. I think people shut each other down a lot based on political stances, which is very counterproductive.
Yeah, because then what it creates is like real life echo chambers where you are kept in the insulated safe haven of your own little circle of relationships where everyone agrees. And so you think this is the right way to think, this is the way society should think.
Yeah.
And then you see the opposite and you're like, oh, no, you're wrong, actually.
So again, it's about like listening and not just talking. I think to begin, we're both in consensus that it can do both. It has the potential to promote dialogue, but also promotes this kind of narrative.
Yeah, I think it's like more of the formation of norms, because I think in competitive debate, it's not just an intellectual conversation, it's also one side trying to one-up the other team. What that leads to sometimes is the use of certain techniques when speaking,
Propaganda.
the military-industrial complex, all of these fun things, with the effort of convincing either a layperson or someone who's also aware of like these internal structures of debate that are not purely about dialogue.
It's almost about forming a narrative, and it's about convincing voters, which are often thought of as like judges. Of course, there's a lot of things that you can manipulate, like statistics. We go with critique cards in debate, right? So it's about what point of view you want people to hear, and you kind of can maneuver around that and use these fancy tactics to achieve where you want to be. That's why there are always two sides to everything, and that's why like the election results can always be a surprise.
Yep,
Yes.
for sure. And I think specifically in the context of debate here, we're talking about competitive debate.
Mm-hmm.
And in a democracy, there's often different kinds of debates. For example, between political leaders or in like running for office, there's going to be debates. And I think that kind of debate is more of a dialogue between two opposing parties where viewers and voters are meant to see the different sides and to be convinced.
Yeah. The good thing about democracy is that there can be a pool of varying opinions, and sometimes from minority parties, so it really gives people an opportunity to see the entirety of what this picture is supposed to be. But obviously, like, these candidates are also going to kind of avoid the downsides of their agenda. So it's about narrative, but it's also about discourse.
Yeah. And when it comes to like emotional appeal, there's tons of like ideologues historically, but in that case it's not really
It's kind of like
democracy.
populism.
Exactly.
You ride on people's anger and then you anger people more so that they vote for you.
Exactly. But I don't think that's what we do most of the time in competitive debate. Debates allow us to engage with topics from different angles, not necessarily one or two. And so I think ultimately it's able to foster more democratic dialogue in the sense that it is an active dialogue, right? One side speaking and another side responding.
Yeah, hopefully. But sometimes it's also that you're talking at someone or people are talking at each other and just really trying to shoot down each other's arguments without actually considering what they are.
Right. That's what happens sometimes, and so
that's also what happens sometimes when we like start researching topics. We think that one side is like impossible to argue, but I think the good thing about competitive debate is that it forces you to see both sides of the issue even if you don't want to. And that's kind of like what democracy is about as well. When you watch like political debates, like you have to parse through things to see people respond to each other. I think that some positions that seem really hard to argue at first can actually turn out to be like a more interesting side. Going into a topic, especially as debaters, you're learning along the way, and the more you learn, the more arguments you see, and you kind of get to open your mind a little bit to things that you maybe initially disagreed with. So I think it's really about just like being open-minded and knowing that there are two sides to everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for me, I feel like it's like when I'm debating, I detach myself from my own personal interests or opinions. Like I think of the topic from an abstracted way, and so in that way, it doesn't become personal.
Oftentimes, when like in real life, it's not really like competitive debate in the sense that you're not trying to cast a ballot for a certain side, but to reach some sort of common ground in the things that you might initially uphold opposing viewpoints for. So I think like in an everyday setting, it's also just about being able to listen and not just being able to talk.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's a mindset. It's really a framework that, like a way to think in terms of debate, be it like just in the everyday world or in competitive debate. It's like, how do you approach a topic without first formulating your opinion, right? How do you listen to both sides and use that information to form your own opinion? I think that's something really valuable that we're able to learn through debate and through listening to debates especially.
Debate is not just about disagreement, but also finding things that you can agree with and listening to other people's perspectives along the way.
And through that, challenging your own preconceptions or misconceptions about different things.
That's why you always take your opponents at their best. Because sometimes like we would be in round and then be like, that's a very bad argument. But then, who knows? You can possibly and likely sometimes lose to it. So it's really about taking arguments at their best and just, like you said, being neutral and being open-minded to it at the get-go. So, you know how like when you go to class or when you're like in a debate team meeting, like the first one of the year, they always ask you like, why do you debate? And I think it's a common response from people to say, oh, I learned debate because I want to win arguments with my dad or with my mom or things like that. But I think in an everyday setting, sometimes it's not about who is right or who is wrong because those things are not objective. Sometimes it's not about argument, it's about listening to each other and communicating. So I think debate is sometimes about arguments, but also sometimes just about communication. And being able to see things from other people's perspectives.
Yeah. And I, for one, have never been able to win an argument with my mom.
Neither have I.
that's a thing, even though I've done competitive debate for, I don't know, a while now. There's always a difference, I feel like.
Yeah.
Because when you're debating, you're persuading a judge almost impersonally. Like, it's not like you're talking to a friend.
It's about, like, I'm objectively right. You're
Yeah,
trying to say
You're
that.
trying to go
Yeah.
with the facts, go with the flow, whereas a lot of the time in one-on-one conversation or just everyday conversations, that's not your goal, right? Because if you go for that, then you're going to destroy all of your human relationships. Yeah. What debate gives you is a way of thinking and an ability to see and communicate your opinion and position and see both sides. But in personal conversations, that skill is used often to, I don't know, moderate the situation and to consider, you know, when's the right time to say something.
And I think, like, in an everyday setting, and this is of course not just applicable to debaters, but to a lot of people, and I think including me sometimes, like, when I get angry and then someone is arguing with me, I kind of say no to everything that they try to say without actually thinking it through. So I think what debate kind of teaches you is to sit back and relax a little bit and then go into the situation with a more calm and composed kind of mindset.
Yeah.
Your goal here is maybe not to win the argument, but to communicate with that person and to kind of protect this kind of affectionate relationship that you initially had with them.
So I think with fact checking,
Yeah.
it's there's a couple of things. Like, in debate, we can in public forum debate specifically, we can call on people's cards, so on their evidence, and we can criticize their evidence based on perhaps a biased source, a biased author, or just like a lack lack of support for the point they're trying to make. I think it's still fairly important, because if you aren't doing the necessary work to do the fact checking and to get like good enough research to support your points, then you're not robustly supporting your points, and you can't have a good debate. Like, there's no grounds for debate if you don't first try to get the facts right.
And I think there are two layers to this. Like, the first layer is where people blatantly lie about their facts or the evidence that they try to cite, in which case, of course, is unacceptable, and it's pretty easy to deal with if you see, oh, this is completely false, you're misconstruing
or
everything.
if the card is completely made up.
But yeah. Or, like, in a second case, which I think is, like, much more common, is that the statistics might be true, and two seemingly contradictory things can be true at the same time. It's about how you interpret those statistics, and it's about kind of how you, in what lens you evaluate it with.
Right.
I think there's always something to criticize when it comes to evidence. And I think in debate, we also see a lot of, like, ad hominems, which might not be the best way to go, but we often say, oh, your card is from the Heartland Institute, and therefore we should not buy it. Objectively, it's not the best way to go about it. It's more about, like, the methodology and things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In terms of accountability, then, it's important and valuable for teams to go into a round with good evidence, and each team, I feel like, is responsible for holding each other accountable for that within the scope of the debate. But just in general, it is good practice to have good evidence in debate. So
I think it's just basic ethics to not blatantly lie about evidence.
I think this is like more of like the fundamentals. Like, this is the groundwork for being able to have a successful debate. And in impromptu debates, this is how you can avoid perhaps having a definitions debate where all you're arguing the whole time is this true, is this not true?
Yeah, and I guess it also helps when you have sources that are reputable, because people always believe in those more. And they're also more likely to be true because, you know, they're popular and people are able to look at it, and so
and they're often like peer reviewed or verified, and so a lot of factors.
And I think it's also interesting that, like, we can look at studies that look at the same things but arrive at very different conclusions. Like, sometimes it's like 10%, and then in the middle of the tournament you're like, oh my god, there's a card that says 50%, let's use that one instead. And sometimes as debaters, I think we don't really look at the methodology, but when it comes to things like democratic discourse or evaluating political stances, it is important to look at how people arrive at their conclusions and not just the conclusion.
That's a lot of what we're doing in debate, is we're looking at the data and we're seeing, okay, what conclusions can we draw from that? But if we don't first understand how that data, like how the researchers arrived at that data, then we have a lot of difficulty extracting a meaningful conclusion from that data. So,
But then when you call on your opponent's evidence, it's really hard to, like, parse through a huge research paper.
Exactly.
Right? So I guess, cut cards. We pray that people cut cards and not just the conclusion.
So ultimately there are still going to be certain limitations to that at the end of the day, but
it's a good skill to have, and it's something that we do often.
The misconception that a lot of people have is that you do competitive debate And in order to win a round, you need to win every single argument. Well, the thing with public forum and just a lot of different formats in general in tournaments, a lot of the judges are parent judges with no experience or background in debate, who are often like not necessarily even completely fluent in English. And you have to convince this audience. Well, how do you do this, right? You're not going to be able to...
Storytelling.
Yeah, exactly. You need to appeal to that level of persuasion, have that ethos, so that you can convince them on a more person-to-person level versus just banking everything on the logical soundness of your arguments. Because for tech judges or for judges with experience with debate, that works. It's, I mean, that's what you're supposed to do.
And I know, like, at tournaments, a lot of us, like, including us too, are guilty of this as well. Like, when we lose, we're like, oh, the judge screwed us over. But in a sense, you're, like, in terms of persuasion, you really have to adapt to the person. And I guess if you lose, you're just not convincing it. You adapt to the setting, you evaluate who is listening, and you adapt to the listener.
Exactly. One of my past coaches once said, like, okay, as long as you lost a round, then you didn't give enough reasons to the judge why you should have won.
We really talked for 20 minutes.